Hi everybody and welcome back to the FPL Family YouTube channel. I'm Sam and today we're going to be looking at the 4 sides that really need to get a good pre-season under their belt, because with new managers at the helm, it's important that these players understand what's expected of them so that we as FPL managers can benefit as much as possible from those all-important FPL points. And we are going to start with one of the most experienced of the new managers in Rafa Benitez. This will be his 4th time managing in the Premier League, having started at Liverpool, had a spell at Chelsea, and finally having been at Newcastle previously. When we have a little look at his Premier League record, it does make for good reading from an Everton perspective, and he has won 13 trophies with 6 different clubs across his managerial career. Now, in his time at Liverpool, he won the Champions League in 2005, he won the FA Cup in 2006, and he finished second in the 2008-2009 season. But he also had 5 consecutive seasons in the top 5 for Liverpool, which was something that they hadn't really done previously. He brought to Liverpool a consistency across their game, which is something that Everton could really benefit from, given how well they started last season. And then, unfortunately for them, they kind of tailed off towards the back end of the season. When we have a little look at Benitez's win percentage, between 2000 and 2016, it never dropped below 48%. And when we consider in that period that he also had a relegation year with Newcastle when he took over and tried to save the club, actually that's quite an impressive stat, because he's talking about a team and managing a team that weren't really very good in that season at all, although he did turn them around completely, winning the championship with them and having them promoted back to the Premier League the following season. So Rafa Benitez doing good things everywhere he's been, but domestically in England, he hasn't necessarily always achieved what we would have expected. Has had great domestic campaigns in Italy and in other parts of the world, winning the Italian Super Cup, the FIFA Club World Cup, the Coppa Italia. But in the UK, just the single FA Cup domestically, and of course the Championship trophy with Newcastle. So that's something that he'll be wanting to rectify with Everton this time around. Now, the good news, Toffees fans, is that whenever Rafa Benitez has been in charge of a club during pre-season, they have always started the campaigns well. And this bodes well when we have a little look at the Everton fixtures. Now, you see them there sat top of the FF Scout fixture ticker for the first 5 game weeks of the season, where they have a really lovely run of fixtures to begin the season. And when we have a little look at Rafa's record, at Inter Milan, he just had 1 defeat in the first 11 games in charge. At Napoli, 2 defeats in the first 15. At Madrid, was unbeaten in the first 14. So actually, when we have a little think about how he starts campaigns with new clubs, it tends to go quite well, but only if he's been there in pre-season. And of course, Rafa was at Everton for the first day of pre-season this time around, so that bodes well. We also see from Rafa's record that he has his most successful campaigns at clubs that come, sorry Everton fans, but outside of the standard European elite clubs. And Liverpool wasn't one of those clubs when Rafa Benitez took over, and his campaign and his managerial time at the club has been it's impressive, right? A Champions League and FA Cup. It was impressive for Rafa, and he did make some building steps for Liverpool to go on to what they've become now. So I think for Everton, it bodes well to have him managing them. We see from him a style of play that is consistent repetitions in training, learning something, drilling it down, really getting the players to understand what is expected of them. And this rigorous drilling doesn't really work when you've got lots of ego players. If you're at a massive club, if you're somewhere like Madrid, it doesn't work as well, because the players have their own clear understanding of what they want to do. At Everton, we don't have many of these big ego players, maybe 1 or 2, but not very many. And that bodes well for Rafa in getting these players well trained and well drilled to do what he wants them to do. When we have a look at his goals conceded rate, it looks good. A rate of less than 1 goal per game he averages in the Premier League, but averaging just 1.53 goals per game. So not going to score a huge amount of goals based on previous records, but should be good for keeping those clean sheets. And that bodes well, especially for Luca Dean. Another positive for owning Luca Dean is that in his time at Newcastle, Matt Ritchie was the most creative defender across the Premier League that season, apart from Luca Dean. because of the way that he played him and the way that he used him on that Newcastle United pitch. And I remember owning Matt Ritchie for a large percentage of that season, and that's something that I think will bode well for Luca Dean going into this season. He very much prefers a back four with wing backs. That system will work for Dean. That's something that we've seen him like to play in the past. And so I think that by doing that, we could be opening ourselves up to a really good defensive option, especially when we go out to those fixtures. The clean sheets look there too. And if he's going to be getting attacking returns also, great stuff for Dean. When we have a little think about how he normally deploys his front men, it's usually kind of spearhead of an arrow. That looks good for Dominic Calvert-Lewin, who you'd expect to be right at the top of that. But for the other players in the Everton side, we might have to see a bit of a change of strategy. For Richarlison, that will mean coming in a little bit. And it'll be interesting to see how that affects him and his style of play going into the new season. But for Dominic Calvert-Lewin, having Benitez in charge probably ends up being a good thing for him. It's going to put him in the position where he's most comfortable and have players more closely in around him, which should benefit him in terms of attacking returns potential. Now let's have a little travel down from Everton to Wolves and their new manager, one of the newest managers in terms of his age. Spent 18 months at Benfica before arriving at Wolves. Much more of an attacking style of play from Bruno Lage than we will see either from Benitez or indeed from Nuno Espirito Santo before he left Wolves. He has been an assistant manager in England before for both Sheffield Wednesday and Swansea City, and so he does have an understanding of the English game. He isn't coming blind into the Premier League from that perspective. When he took over at Benfica, they were 4th in the league, 7 points behind Porto, who are currently winning at that point. He went on to be champions of the Portuguese league that year, scoring a record equalling 103 goals during that campaign. But the season after, it did absolutely drop off a cliff. Just 10 points from 10 games saw him lose his job as Benfica manager. So we will have to see how this pans out in terms of which Bruno Lage that we're going to get for Wolves and how is his kind of opening campaign going to be for them. Generally speaking, he seems to prefer a 4-4-2 formation with full-backs being absolutely key. They were asked to overlap, and those full-backs, his two that he had when at Benfica, managed 6 goals and 23 assists between them across the 2 seasons, 1.5 seasons that he was in charge at the club. Now that could be really good for the likes of Semedo and Aït-Nouri at Wolves, and we could see them really pushing forward as FPL assets. When we have a little bit of a look further forward on the pitch then, we've got some really talented players at Wolves. Particularly I'm thinking about the likes of Neto and Traoré, maybe even couple in Podence and Trinquillo, who's their new player there also. By playing this kind of wing-back formation, encouraging players to come in and then get out wide, we should see some improved stats from these guys, because attacking-wise, the Wolves' output was poor at best last season. Now, of course, that was because they lost Jimenez back in November, and with him back now in training, we should hopefully see a return to the old Wolves that we all knew and loved from a FPL perspective. The wingers are, of course, going to be key, but he is attack-minded, and that bodes well for us picking attacking players from a Wolves perspective. Now, when we have a little look at their fixtures, they're not quite as good as Everton's, but they're not terrible. Kind of see them there. I think they are 7th in the fixture ticker. Now, on paper, they look okay-ish. Leeds, Spurs, Manchester United in the first 3, not ideal. But game week 4 onwards, there is a fixture shift, as we can begin to see there. Watford and Brentford in game weeks 4 and 5, followed by Southampton, Newcastle and Villa between game week 6 and game week 8. This is perfect for us as FPL managers, because we can take our time, watch how Wolves get on in those first 3 game weeks, see how they go pre-season, and then jump on them around wildcard time for a lot of managers in game week 4 when their fixtures change for the better. And whether we're going to invest in Neto, Traoré, Jimenez, Podence, one of those front guys, or whether we see something from Aït-Nouri and Semedo at the back, which would make us look like we're going to invest in the back line, remains to be seen. But I think they all potentially could be good options. Now, from one more Wolves manager to the old Wolves manager, Nuno Espirito Santo, he finally ended the Spurs campaign for a new manager after, I think it was 72 days of nonsense, quite frankly, from Spurs, where they pretty much interviewed every manager on the planet. Now, from a Spurs perspective, when asked why after all of this searching for a manager, why was it eventually Nuno? They said that it was because he has lots of different styles of play and he's very open-minded about which style of play he uses. We've seen Nuno play 4-3-3, 4-2-3-1, 4-4-2, 3-4-3. Like, there's been a lot of different formations that he's deployed over his time at Wolves, and that looks good from a Spurs perspective. He also is more of a defensive-minded manager, so not exactly what Levy said to the Spurs fans he was looking for. However, his counter-attack football looks like it could be a good thing for the likes of Kane and Son. He had a very successful first season at Wolves, where he was promoted, finished 7th in the Premier League in the 18-19 season, 7th again in the 19-20 season, and made it to the quarterfinals of the Europa League in that season with Wolves. He didn't have the biggest squad at Wolves, and there were lots of issues last season, particularly with injuries to key players, Jimenez especially. And that lack of depth in the squad did mean that there were a lack of goals for Wolves. But I don't think that that is necessarily Nuno's fault. They were 6th in the league when Jimenez fractured his skull. And of course, after that, it was a bit of a tale of woe for them. But I don't think that that's necessarily a negative thing when we're looking at him from a Spurs point of view. Generally, he favoured a 3-4-3 at Wolves, counter-attacking formation, which does work with those Spurs players. And we've seen in the past that that is a system that you can get on board with at Spurs. But what it should mean is that defensively we have another option. Now, Rodon is one that I am seriously looking at to see what happens with him in pre-season. He's gone back to training early after his campaign in the Euros with Wales, because he wanted to show willing. So that for me is something that we shouldn't overlook. And at 4.5 million, if we do go with wing backs, which is what I'm expecting from Nuno, and we have therefore 3 at the back, Rodon will be part of that, and at 4.5 million could be a nice option. But I'm not sure you're necessarily going to want to invest in that if we're deploying the wing back fullback roles, because with Doherty, who we know can play really well under Nuno from his time at Wolves, 8 goals and 15 assists under him last time out when they were playing together at Wolves. And of course, Reguilón, who's now been confirmed to be staying at Spurs because Madrid are not activating their clause that means they can buy him back. We should see some great attacking potential from both of them, and therefore those two are the players that I'm highlighting as ones to definitely watch in pre-season for Spurs. And of course over game week 1, because that game week 1 fixture against Manchester City, I don't think you're buying a Spurs defender, but you might want to after the fixtures take a change. Now, of course, we do, if we go back to the fixture ticker, have some nice fixtures in game week 2 and 3 against Wolves and Watford. But actually after that, we then start to see some more difficult fixtures for Spurs when they play Chelsea. And then after that in game week 6, they have Arsenal. So we need to kind of see how that pans out. But there's 3 fixtures there in the middle between game week 2 and game week 4, which we could target from a Spurs defensive perspective. And then after game week 6, we might be also doing that. But then again, attacking potential from fullbacks and wingbacks, particularly if we're looking at Reguilón and Doherty, with Aurier looking like he's going to leave the club. There's definitely scope in some of those other more difficult games for attacking returns. I'm not so sure about that Chelsea game. That would put me off a little bit. Dele Alli, I think, is another interesting one to mention at this point. I mentioned him a couple of times in other videos. His pre-season training and his commitment has been second to none, actually, since he's returned. Well, actually, even before the summer, he'd spent a lot of time out in Dubai training again, talking about how he learnt a lot last season and how it was his responsibility that he wasn't playing enough games. I'm really interested to see how he gets on with Nuno. They're doing a lot of talking in every video, and every photograph that I see from the Tottenham training ground seems to contain Nuno and Dele together. He's one I'm watching because at 6.5 million, he is a bit of a bargain if he gets regular first team football at Spurs. Son and Kane, of course, had their best FPL seasons last season. Son is about to sign a new contract. Let's see what happens with Kane. Nuno was told at interview stage that Kane was staying, as were all of the managers that were interviewed for the Spurs job. So let's see whether Levy can actually manage to make that happen. And finally, our last new manager in the Premier League this time around, Patrick Vieira, arriving at Crystal Palace. He had 11 first team players leave because their contracts expired at the end of the 2021 season, which is not exactly ideal when you are starting a new job. Having said that, though, it does give him plenty of opportunity to bring in new players and make this team absolutely his own. And when we have a little look at his record then, his record at New York is far better than his record at Nice in terms of win percentage, but also in terms of the lack of lost games. Also, he also scored a lot more goals for New York than he did with Nice. But That is in part because New York City are one of the feeder clubs for the Manchester City group, the City group, and therefore I would expect him to have better quality players. And in the MLS, he did have some of the best players in the league. At Nice, that just wasn't the case, and therefore it was much more difficult for him. He left New York through his own choice to go to Nice, and after finishing 7th and 5th with Nice with his 2 seasons there, he was then fired. So bit up and down when it comes to Nice themselves, but actually his record with New York City does look good, and it'll be interesting to see which way we fall. I would argue that actually Palace don't have the kind of squad that New York did, and therefore it might be a bit more of a struggle with them. He said in his kind of opening talks about Palace, I want them to score more goals, to have more shots on target. I want to put a philosophy in place that my players understand so that when they go on the field, they can express themselves. That's great on paper, but at Nice he prioritised defending, conceding 35 goals with them. Now, actually, that sounds quite a lot, but it was actually 17 goals less than his predecessor there did. So defensively, he did make them more solid, and he did work on that. In his second season at the club, he scored on average 1.46 goals per game, which again doesn't suggest that he's going to be prioritising attack, given that if you look at that in comparison to the Premier League sides, that would have sat him in mid-table last year in terms of goals scored. He does like to have an organised team though, play possession football. Now that is something that's going to fundamentally have to change at Crystal Palace if this is going to work out successfully. He likes the patient build-up play. That's not what we get at Crystal Palace. Last season, only Newcastle and West Brom had less possession than Palace. They were the 3rd worst for XG conceded, the 2nd worst for XG, just 0.23, ranked 14th for goals, 18th for shots, and 19th for big chances. Wow, the stats on paper look awful, as do the fixtures where they sit there second bottom of the fixture ticker. Now, again, from a positive perspective, this means nobody's really going to be investing in Crystal Palace in the early part of the season. And of course, then it means we've got 5 games to work out who is starting at the back, which are the Premier League new boys, because there's bound to be new signings for Palace this season, which of them look like being the best options. And then when we do want to make our move on Palace, because we understand where Vieira's priorities are and how they've started well, be it defensively or attackingly, we can kind of focus in on that. Just to end though, as a positive for Palace fans, his record for New York, 1st for the most wins in the division with 39, 1st for the most points with 139, and 3rd for goals scored per game at 1.78. So there is definitely some underlying stats that suggest Vieira could be the right man to improve this Crystal Palace side. That's it for me today. Thank you for watching. If you've liked the video, please give it a like. If you haven't already done so, please hit that subscribe button. And there are plenty of other videos on the channel at the moment. A couple of them are listed here. Make sure you watch them. Leave me a comment in the description below to let me know which of the new manager clubs you are investing in during this pre-season.